before we get started here, I want to talk about the sources and give a big thanks to Mr. Saturnax, who's been a big part of these sub briefs lately, and I think we'll continue to work with him very closely as he has a huge library of photographs that he has very generously made available for each one of these briefs. So a large number of the photographs you see today come directly from Saturnax's resources. So I want to say a big thank you to him. I also had a chance to sit down and talk with him for a couple hours, and he seems like a really good guy. So I would encourage everyone to go to his Twitter page if you have a Twitter account, if you use Twitter, and give the man a follow, if for no other reason than to say thank you. And if you do that, you'll also get to see some of his great posts. He's always posting good pictures of submarines mostly, but he has, everything else. He's got weapons and surface ships. I think I even saw airplanes in there. So he's got a huge, huge library, and he's a big part of these sub briefs. So thank you, Mr. Saturnax, for everything you do for us here. The next big source we have is deepstorm.ru. If you're familiar with my sub briefs, you know that I've used them on nearly every one of these. This is a great website that's maintained by current and former Navy crewmen who update their experiences on these older hulls as they become declassified, and they can talk about what happened during the Cold War. And that's how we get some of the great stories that we talk about, like you're going to hear today, is from this website, deepstorm.ru. Russian ships info we use to verify some of the dates and times from Deep Storm, because some of that is lost in the translation. Accidents in nuclear ships from December 1996, I used to find even more incidents than what they talked about. The Echo 2 SSGN that we will go over today has a lot of nuclear problems, a lot of contamination, a lot of crew getting radiated. So I had to verify that with accidents in nuclear ships. And finally, FAS.org has a section of naval accidents as well, where I was able to confirm not only nuclear problems, but collisions and a lot of other things that happen to this Echo 2 SSGN. So without further ado, and this is going to be a long one, let's begin. Echo 2 SSGN Project 675, written and read by Aaron Amick. Our story begins on August 17th, 1956, when Project 675 is authorized. Remember, Project 675 is authorized alongside two other projects, the November, which is the fast attack Type 1 nuclear submarine coming out of the Soviet Union, and the Hotel, which is the SSBN ballistic missile submarine Type 1 coming out at the same time. All three of these ships, the Echo, November, and Hotel, use the same engine room. 2 screws, 2 reactors, pushing the submarine through the water. What's different is the mission and equipment on each submarine. So this is one we're going to talk about that shoots the P6 anti-ship cruise missile. The Echo 2 versus the Echo 1 has 8 launchers instead of 6, 10 watertight compartments, the CIM 100 sonar system, which is a very archaic sonar system, but it's the one they had in 1956, so that's what they planned on going ahead with at the time. A big capability that they had planned for the P6 was that this missile could eventually be handed off or get targeting data from aircraft, Tu-95 aircraft and the Ka-25 Hormone aircraft. Could provide initial target data for missile launch. But that wasn't right away. And in October 1958, 2 short years after it's been authorized, plans are sent to shipyards in Sevmash, which is Severodvinsk, Russia, and Komsomolets on Amur, which is over on the eastern face of Russia, facing the Pacific Ocean, to begin building these submarines. So in order to understand the Echo program, Project 675, we need to understand the P6 cruise missile, because the entire purpose of the Echo existing is this missile. So they developed this missile first. This program began before the Echo program. It's a 10-meter missile with a 2.5-meter wingspan when its wings are fully deployed. It launches with the wings retracted down by its side, and then as it leaves the launch tube, it extends the wings horizontally. It goes from a 500-meter cruise altitude up to 7,000 meters, which is very high. And the reason why a cruise missile would go up to 7,000 meters is so that it can use its radar to detect targets. One advanced capability that this P6 had, and this is again late 50s, early 60s, is that it could use the lead missile of the group to find targets and share targeting data from the lead missile. whenever I was in the Navy, we knew the P500 had this, which is the next missile in this family. What I didn't know is the P6 also had this capability in the early 60s. This is insane that they would have data link missile-to-missile communication in 1960s. But they did with the P6 cruise missile. Is a radar-guided, radar homing, 450-kilometer range is kind of generous, but it could, I guess, go that far if it was at 70 or 7,000 meters and just ballistically went the full possible distance. But typically, it's more like 300 kilometers. It would shoot its salvos of 4 missiles. So with a total of 8, it would have 2 salvos, and it would take 12 minutes for the missile to get to its target if the target was at maximum range. So she could shoot 2 salvos in approximately 30 minutes by shooting 1 salvo, directing the missile with its radar while the submarine is on the surface, and it would use the ship's radar, the submarine radar initially. Once it got to its enable point, which is the point at which the missile turns its own radar on, then it could take the fire. That's where the missile becomes autonomous and no longer needs the guidance radar from the submarine to guide it. Then they would shift gears to the second salvo, transfer targeting data that they had to the last 4 missiles on board, and then shoot those and direct them for up to 12 minutes. Obviously, if the target is closer, it doesn't take full 12 minutes to get to them. But at maximum range, which is probably where they would want to deploy this for self-preservation reasons, it would take approximately 30 minutes to conduct an attack. That is an extremely long time in modern warfare, and the submarine would likely not survive that. Even if it managed to get the attack off and dive, there would be airplanes dropping torpedoes on this in its vicinity in under that 30-minute time. See, there's 3 different radar modes, which allowed 3 salvos from different subs to launch simultaneously. And that's how they wanted to use these, was that they would have a Wolfpack type situation where they would have multiple echo surface simultaneously, turn on their radars. Each radar, even though they're the same, would have slightly different carrier frequencies. And then their missiles would just look for their radar from their submarine as they went about the same mission. So you could have 3 different submarines launching at the same time without confusion. Initial target data could come from the Tu-95 Tupolev. These had to be specially equipped Tupolev. It wasn't just any Tu-95. It was very specific ones. And lead missile, like I said, could provide targeting data for up to 3 other missiles. Okay, the Echo 2 SSGN is 115 meters long, 9.3 meters a beam, that's wide. She displaces 5,700 tons submerged and can go 22 knots. So even though she has the same engine room as the November, she's not as fast as the November because of all this extra equipment and weight. She's also not as hydrodynamic. Her test depth is 300 meters. She has 6 torpedo tubes, but these are broke up. There's 4 forward, 53 centimeter, and 2 aft, 40 centimeter, smaller diameter ones, but they're facing aft. This is one of the last submarine classes to have rear-facing torpedo tubes after World War II. She shoots 8 P6 missiles, and those missiles are guided by Success, which is the name of the radar guiding the missile initially, or the upgraded Kasataka target designating radar. The Kasataka is the one that can take targeting data from the Tu-95 and the Hormone helicopter. Initially, it's just the Success radar. Okay, so here's the Aft Torpedo Room that I was talking about. Again, she has 4 53 centimeters forward, but 2 40 centimeter torpedo tubes aft, and you can see they have 4 stows. So if they had the tubes fully loaded and the stows loaded, they could have up to 6 missiles or 6 torpedoes back here facing afterwards. But these would be smaller diameter, electrically driven torpedoes. Electrically driven would mean typically a shorter range than a thermal torpedo that uses a liquid fuel. All right, so Sevmash Shipyard in Severodvinsk, Russia is one of the 2 shipyards building the Echo 2. In this first half of the lecture, we're just going to talk about Sevmash Shipyard and its submarines going into the Norwegian Sea, Atlantic, and Mediterranean. All right, let's begin with K166. October 1963, She's operational. In November 1963, she joins the Northern Fleet in the Murmansk region. The reason why we say Murmansk region is that there are a number of submarine bases in the Kola Peninsula based around Murmansk. And so while this hull may go to one of those bases, the next hull to come out may go to a different base that's right across the bay, but they're all part of the same fleet under the same leadership. So we call it the Murmansk region. In August 1965, she conducts the first 4-missile salvo in the White Sea. The White Sea is that body of water between Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. It's a small bay area where they can do testing away from the eyes of NATO. And that's where they do the first successful missile testing there. In 1966, she sails 5,600 miles, basically for crew training, down into the Norwegian Sea and back again. She does that multiple times, running drills, getting used to the equipment on this brand new first flight of the submarine. In 1969, she does have her first reactor incident requiring a refueling of the reactor. So there must have been some kind of damage to the reactor vessel to cause that. And the crew is radiated from this. I don't have any other details than that, unfortunately, but there were crew injuries, high radiation in the submarine. Crews were injured, and they had to refuel her. In December 1970, while purging high-pressure air from airbank number 5, an explosion occurred. This happens whenever you try to bleed off air from an air reducer from an airbank too fast. You can literally use the high-pressure energy in the air system to rip that reducer apart, and that's what it did. It literally blew the reducer apart and damaged compartment 4. There's no injuries that I'm aware of, which is very fortunate if no one got hurt. 1972, the reactor fuel is finally complete. So that explosion of Airbank 5 happened while she was in port. In 1973, after she has her reactor refueled, while on deployment in the Mediterranean Sea, there's a fire in compartment 8. That's back in the engine room. So it extremely damages the engine room to the point to where she cannot maneuver, and she's in the med. So what they do is they fly some technicians down to the med to repair her to get propulsion back, where she can return to port under her own power in about 3 weeks. They repaired her on site. In 1983, 10 years later, she deploys again to the Atlantic for 2 months. Now, her endurance is about 50 days, which isn't quite 2 months, but if she pulls into port at any time during this deployment, that resets the endurance counter back to 0 because she can get more food and stuff, stores, to go out for another 50 days. So some of these deployments you'll see last much longer than 50 days. Just know that's 50 days between a port visit. Okay, after 1984, she didn't deploy anymore. She was dry docked in 1988 and removed from service by directive from the General Staff of the Navy. But she wasn't decommissioned, so she gets a new name in 1992 of B-71. They just turned the K to a B. And that has something to do with redesignating these submarines as light or small submarines versus large, heavy submarines like the Typhoon. So she gets the B designation in 1992. You'll see that a lot in this lecture and other lectures. 1992 is that's when they made this decision to change these names. Okay, in 2000, 2003, she's defueled and scrapped. She's literally razor blades currently. K166 is gone. K104 is the second submarine to come out of Sevmash. In December 1963, she's operational, and in January 1964, the very next month, she joins the Northern Fleet in the Murmansk region. In 1965, she completes her first 50-day deployment to the Atlantic, and in 1970, she does her first Mediterranean deployment. In 1973, she successfully tests a 2-salvo firing of the P-6 missile. So this is the first time that we have record of 2 salvos back-to-back, taking almost 30 minutes, occur successfully. In 1974, she does have a fire in the engine room during deployment, but there are no injuries, and she returns to port under her own power. So it's a minor fire, if there can be one of those. 1976 to 1981, she's modernized to Project 675MK, and we'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of these submarines are going to get different upgrades, and we'll talk about each one of those as they happen for the first time, but not every time. In 1983, with this new upgrade, she does annual deployments to the Mediterranean to 1988. And then in 1990, she's removed from service, but not decommed yet, so she gets her new name, B-104, in 1992. 2002, she is in dry dock and she rolls off her keel blocks while in dry dock, damaging the ship and the dry dock as she rolls over. The way this happened was whenever you'd put a ship or submarine in dry dock, you have to calculate the center of gravity and make sure that center of gravity is right in the center of the keel blocks that's holding the ship or submarine up. That's how you keep it balanced there. Well, whenever they had modified her in 1976 to Project 675MK, that changed the center of gravity. But in 2000, whenever they dry docked her, they didn't account for that upgrade. They went with the original center of gravity from 1963. And so because that center of gravity was miscalculated, whenever they were working on her, changing weight on the port and starboard side, they had changed just enough weight to one of the sides to cause it to roll over. And that's how that happened. And in 2005, her hull was completely disassembled. All right, so let's talk about Project 675MK. A total of 9 of these Echo 2s get this specific upgrade. It is the P500 missile, which is NATO named Sandbox. It is a large missile. It has a 2,200-pound conventional warhead, or it is nuclear capable. It can have 350 kiloton warhead as well. The biggest difference, though, is this is a supersonic missile. So instead of being the 0.9 Mach that the P6 was, it is 2.5 Mach max speed just over the surface of the water. Supersonic anti-ship missile up to 300 nautical miles, semi-active homing, very, very deadly missile. This missile scared the hell out of NATO when it became operational because it is a ship killer. It's designed to kill carriers, and if you hit enough of them, it will do that job. It can receive a mid-course correction from the Tu-95 and the Ka-25 Hormone. The Hormone is a helicopter. She gets the submarine now, gets the Argon K fire control system that talks to this new missile. You need a new missile fire control system, talk to the new missile. The Nakata ESM, which is the bulbous looking thing you see there on the sail on the right, has like little light bulb looking things on it. Those aren't actually light bulbs. Those are sensors that detect radar frequencies. And that's why they're different sizes and shapes pointing in different directions. They give the operator that's in the submarine the direction, signal strength, and type of radar it's receiving. The MGK-100 Kerch sonar system, which is the upgraded sonar system, we called it Pike Jaw in the Navy, in the U.S. Navy. And the Kasataka Satellite Target Designation Sensor, which is a modification to the Success radar you see there that also takes data from the Hormone and the Tu-95. So it's as of this upgrade, they can work with aircraft to provide initial target data to the missiles. They still need to surface to shoot them and guide them, but they can get initial target data from the target that they're going to shoot from airplanes initially. And there's the Molina communication suite for radio. All right, K-170, December 1963, she's operational. January 1964, she joins the Northern Fleet in the Murmansk region. That year, she does deploy to the Norwegian Sea. And a few years later, in 1968, K-170 deploys to the Atlantic. Now, in 1973 to 1980, she goes through a long overhaul where she doesn't deploy. She's getting a modification to the hull itself. And it's designated Project 675N. And because this is the only submarine to get this change, we'll talk about it now. This is a Special Forces Delivery Mothership mod. So they took her from her original mission of shooting missiles, got rid of all that. As you can see in the picture here, the missile launchers are gone, and they widened the hull on the underside beneath the sail. What that widening is for a docking mechanism to a miniature sub. They have a miniature battery-powered sub that can undock from this submarine, go for a few miles, drop off Special Forces, loiter there. When Special Forces come back, pick them up and bring them back to the submarine. It's like a little ferry that goes back and forth between the bottom of the submarine and near-shore facilities, near-shore targets for delivering Special Forces. And in 1981, she's operational. She's doing this. In 1985, they give her a new name, KS, S for Special, 86. They completely changed the hull number from 170 to 86. This is something very common in the Russian Navy, Soviet Navy, so don't be thrown off by that. A lot of these submarines we talk about today will have at least 2 names. So she goes from being K-170 to KS-86, Special Forces Support Ship. In 1988, she does have a major propulsion failure where she's by the pier and they're practicing a rapid startup of the nuclear reactor. This is a common drill. Whenever you get a chance to go underway, you can bring the reactor up normally or you can bring it up quickly. And it is important that the crew know how to do both, because in a wartime scenario, you're probably going to be bringing the reactor up to critical quickly. Well, they're doing this rapid ascension in temperature in the primary secondary loop whenever they mess it up and they overheat the main turbine, which is like the main engines that turn the screws, literally melting the turbine blades. So not only does the blades no longer turn anymore, they're all melted and fused together. It's no longer a turbine, it's a hunk of metal. They literally scrapped their own ship during reactor startup in 1988. And in 1991, she is removed from service, doesn't even get a chance to get a name in 1992 because she is gone before that happens. K-172, she's operational in July 1964, joins the Northern Fleet in August of the same year. In 1966 to 67, she completes 2 deployments to the Norwegian Sea. Relatively short deployments, but she's out there doing her thing. In 1968, 11 days into a Mediterranean Sea deployment, there is a mass poisoning of the crew on board the ship. The way this happened was there was a container of mercury on board the submarine. I don't know why it was there, but it was there. It probably had a purpose, but it was not stowed properly. And the bottle holding the mercury shattered and broke, and mercury went everywhere in the 3rd compartment. This was either caused by or reported to the ship's doctor. Being mercury, it was probably the ship's doctor that was handling the mercury, and he probably dropped it or broke it. He was there at the time that it happened. He informed the XO. The 2 of them decided to not inform the captain or the crew that there was mercury all over the place. They got some rags, and with their hands, they scooped it up and they put it into a drain, allowing it to drain down into the bilge where it could then be pumped overboard. Well, before it could be pumped overboard, fumes from the mercury got throughout the ship and poisoned all but 13 members of the crew. Tested positive for mercury poisoning. They had headaches and everything that comes along with that. It was a nightmare. And because they didn't tell the captain and inform anybody and pump the bilge right away and dispose of it properly, they end up almost killing a lot of this crew. Thankfully, nobody died in this, but all but 13 sailors were poisoned. In 1972 to 73, she sailed to Cuba with a fleet of ships. Whenever they make Cuba runs, they go down there with a submarine tender and usually a couple of large cruiser and destroyer size surface warships. It's kind of a reward for the crew for successful deployments and whatnot. It's a good PR stunt, and it's right off the coast of America. So they like showing their new shiny nuclear submarines when they work and aren't poisoning their crew in Cuba. In 1974 to 1978, she completes 4 deployments without incident. So she's off to a good start. She has a 4-year refuel period in the 80s, 81 to 85, where she's overhauled and refuels both reactors. And then she goes to sea again in 1986 for 4 more deployments to 1989 with no problems. So she has a great record in the 1980s until June 15th, 1989. There is a leak in the reactor loop that is detected, and the reactor is scrapped. She has a second reactor, so this is not a big problem. But the second reactor, while running at 55%, manages to burn its power core, nearly causing a meltdown in the second reactor. So she loses both her reactors and the primary means of propulsion. So, and whenever they overheated the reactor the second time, they radiated some of the crew in the engine room in the process of doing that. So she lost her propulsion. 2 days later, or actually it's about a week later, she's taken under tow by a steamship and is towed back to port because she's not making too much progress on her diesel engines only. In 1984, while in port, she began taking on water forward. So she's tied to the pier. She begins flooding up in the torpedo room. It's not clear why, but the crew manages to seal off the forward compartments. Compartments 1 and 2 completely flood. They bring up large pontoons on the starboard side and tie her to these pontoons to keep her from sinking. So she's got the pier tied up on one side, these large pontoons on the other, keeping her afloat for 5 years. She stays that way until 1999. And in 1999, due to high contamination of the reactor accident that happened 10 years before, they decide to scrap the entire submarine. So instead of just decommissioning the reactor compartment like they normally would, they leave the entire submarine intact, and they're going to tow it and stow the entire submarine as if it is nuclear or radioactive contaminated, because it is. Now, they did revisit her in 2004, and for a couple years, slowly cleaned her up, decontaminated the sections that they could outside the reactor compartment, and cut her back into scrap. And now her reactor compartment is in long-term storage by itself. K-74, correction, K-47. In August 1964, she's operational. September 1964, she joins the Northern Fleet. That's the next month. In March 1967, while measuring noise for K-113, another submarine, she ascends to the surface too fast, nearly colliding with K-113. This all happens under the observation of an icebreaker that's monitoring the evolution, which is normal for this. But on that icebreaker is the Flag Admiral, Nikolai Reznov, and he is the boss of both of these captains. So he had some words with them after that happened. Now, this is a normal thing. Not almost colliding is not normal, but doing these sound measurements is a normal thing. Because what we have on even the NATO navies, we have our own field of hydrophones somewhere in the world. Where that is no one's business. And we like to drive over these hydrophones to see if we have any loud noise sources that we may not be aware of. And so the problem is we have more submarines than we have these facilities. So a lot of times 2 submarines will get together and rig themselves as quiet as they can be and drive very, very close to each other and see if there's any noise problems. Well, that's what they were doing when they nearly collided with each other in front of their Flag Admiral. All right. 3 years later, 1970, 1972, she gets modernized to Project 675K. In September 1976, with this new mod, an electrical fire starts in the engine room while on deployment, and due to heavy smoke, 3 sailors died in compartment 9. They couldn't get through the compartment where the fire was in compartment 7 and 8 to get forward of the fire, and they essentially ran out of air and died due to smoke inhalation. In 1977 to 1983, she does annual deployments to both the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. In 1984 to 1990, she does a long 6-year refuel and overhaul and upgrades her fire control system to the Argon K during this refuel and overhaul. In 1992, she does get renamed B-47, but just 2 years later, she's removed from service. And in 2002, her reactor is moved into long-term storage. The rest of the submarine is cut apart. All right, so let's talk about this Project 675K. Only 2 units out of all the Echo 2s get this specific upgrade. And that's they get the upgraded ESM, you can see there with it fully raised. They get the MGK-100 Kirch sonar, which is pike jaw. And the Kasataka B satellite comm and target designating receiver, which is the bulge on the sail that you can see there, and a modification to the radar on the bow of the sail. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but you've seen in pictures already, the front of the sail of the Echo 2 pivots. Normally this radar is facing rear and it's encapsulated into the sail. But what you're seeing here is the radar turned about 120 degrees from its normal position, facing forward a little bit. And that's how they direct the missiles initially, if they don't have initial targeting data from another platform. Okay, K1 says September is operational in September 1964. She joins the Northern Fleet the next month. In 1965 to 67, she conducts annual deployments to the Atlantic. There's a missile weapon accident in 1967 with no injuries, but it causes her to go back into dry dock a little bit early, and for about 4 years is under repair. So that missile weapons accident must have caused severe damage, and they were very lucky to not injure any sailors in that time. After she gets out of dry dock, she does deploy to the Norwegian Sea in 1972 and in the Atlantic in 1973, where she does do a Cuba visit with a tender. In June 1973, off the coast of Cuba, she runs aground on a reef and is beached there until tugs can come alongside and tow her off. She has severe damage to the bow, and she returns to port on the surface. 5 years later, in June 1978, salt contaminates the steam generators and the secondary loop, damaging the turbines. That's a lot of salt if you're damaging turbines with the salt in the system. So that had been going on for a while before they caught it. She ends up having to be towed to port because the turbines aren't working properly anymore in 1978. From 1981 to 1984, she's upgraded to Project 675 MKV. This is a major upgrade. Takes 3 years to install it in the 80s. In 1984, a missile test results in 10 out of 18 successful launches of the P-1000 missile. The P-1000 is the next generation missile after the P-500. Now, a quick side note on the P-1000, even though a number of hulls are upgraded to use this missile, at no point does any Echo 2 actually go on deployment with the P-1000. They're capable of launching it. They do test it. They never actually conduct a mission with it. They always actually do their missions with the P-500 missile. In 1986 to 1989, she conducts annual deployments to the Atlantic, again with the P-500s. And in finally 1992, she is renamed Bravo 1, but is removed from service and decommissioned after 1992. All right, so let's talk about Project 675 MKV. 5 units get this upgrade. It's a P-500 guided missiles. She can test the P-1000 guided missiles. She has the Argonne 675 MKV fire control system, which is capable of talking to the P-1000s. But again, she's only deploying with P-500s. They give her the SAM shoulder-launched missiles that the crew can carry into the sail, called the Strela 3M. They keep a total of 6 of these on board. This is basically like a Stinger missile on a shoulder launcher for a crewman. She gets the NACAT ESM, the MGK 100 pike jaw sonar, and the Kasaka SATCOM and fire control radar. That allows them to talk to the Tu-95s. And here's a great shot of the missile control stations. You can see the handles where the operators can control not just the radar, but also the missile following the radar beam until it gets to an enable point, which is the point at which it turns on its own radar. They can use these consoles to steer each missile. Remember, they're only doing 4 at a time. Okay, K-28, also known as K-428. In December 1964, she becomes operational. 1 month later, January 1965, she joins the Northern Fleet. In 1966, she conducts missile testing successfully. The success rate of this missile is about 60 to 70%. So out of the 8 missiles total launched, they expect 6 to actually work. That's what they're seeing after all these tests. She does deploy to the Norwegian Sea in 1967 and is upgraded to a different project, Project 675 MU, for 7 years. It takes a long time to convert her to this upgrade. It's a one-of-one modification, so we'll talk about it now. She gets the P-500 capability, the new ESM, and the sonar upgrade, and that's it. So she's got the fire control that can talk to the 500, but not the 1000, the new ESM, and the new sonar. But that took 7 years to install. In 1978, she's renamed K-428, just completely changed the name of the submarine. I believe this is done to confuse intelligence gathering, to confuse NATO into thinking they may have more submarines than they actually have, when it's in reality, it's the same submarine. They just stopped using K-28 and went to K-428. Or it could be because of its new capability. The 428 means something to the Russian Navy that NATO never figured out. I don't know which one of those is true. They both could be true, but they change the names of these submarines a lot, and it can be confusing. In 1981, she shadows the USS John F. Kennedy battle group in the Med. Does a good job doing that, conducting missile drills and whatnot. In 1982 to 87, she does annual deployments to either the Atlantic or the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1990, she's removed from service, so she never gets the Bravo designation. That's K28, everybody. K74, she's operational in 1965. In August 1965, she joins the Northern Fleet. In November of the same year, while returning from a successful combat training exercise, the throttles stop responding to the operator, but they fail open instead of shut. So the main turbine slowly builds up speed, turning the screw faster and faster and faster until finally, because they have no mechanical means of stopping the steam going to the turbine, because that's what failed, the turbine, the main engine, rips itself apart, rips the cover off. The turbine blades fly everywhere like a grenade going off in the engine room, and completely destroys the primary engines that turn the screw. In 1965, she goes back into dry dock, has all these repairs completed by the next year. It's kind of a miracle that they repaired it that fast, but they did. Repaired her in August 1966, and where she begins test firing missiles in the Norwegian Sea. In 1967 to 70, she conducts 3 deployments, normal deployments, no events. 6 years later, she's in port when the Freon fire suppression system is activated accidentally into a compartment. Chief Foreman Chugnikov has his work group down there. He's able to isolate the Freon with no visibility, because the Freon is a gas that is obscuring vision, and he saves his entire work team by manually shutting down the Freon going into the compartment that him and his work team are working in. He ends up losing consciousness in the process of doing this. It's very heroic action on his part. They drag him topside where there's some fresh air, and they get him breathing again, and he recovers. So he saved his team from suffocating from this Freon fire suppression system. Now, this Freon fire suppression system is used on a lot of these old Soviet boats, and they've killed more sailors than they've saved. But it's a very dangerous system because it displaces oxygen, and it also limits visibility. And it was fortunate that this happened in port, where they had a way to get away from this gas. And kudos to this chief foreman who saved who knows how many people from suffocating. In 1974 to 1982, they conduct 8 deployments in that time period. 84 to 86 is a typical dry dock period for them. And then they go back to Atlantic deployments from 88 to 89. In May 1991, an unauthorized launch sequence of a test missile begins in port with K-74, and this is just craziness. They're tied up to the pier. They're doing something with the missile system. It could be maintenance. It could be drills. We don't know. Because the whole crew wasn't involved, it probably was not a drill. But for some reason, one of the missile launchers that holds, a missile is ordered to activate and raise. And this is on kind of an automatic system where the raising and locking and opening in place is done by a single command, and then it begins. And this takes about 60 seconds. Well, there's a warrant officer on board who may be the person conducting the maintenance. We're not sure. But he recognizes that the missile launcher has begun its launch sequence, and he has about 60 seconds to try and stop it. So he goes to the missile control console, which is that panel there. He racks out, because it's not responding normally with the controls, he racks out the drawers that have the electrical components inside and begins removing the cards that control the launch of the missile. Well, as he's removing the cards, the missiles lock in place, the outer doors do open, and the rocket motor is ignited while in port, tied to the pier. This missile leaves the submarine, flies over land, past warehouses, depots, parking lots. The command headquarters is right there. Past all that, eventually hits a power pole up on a hill and breaks apart into however many pieces. But some of those pieces scatter across a parade ground that's there on the base. And unfortunately, there was some midshipmen probably doing marching drills, but midshipmen on the parade ground. And one of them gets struck by parts of this missile, and it does kill him very sadly. So kind of a sad ending to what is otherwise a completely bonkers story of a missile completely launching itself in port for reasons unknown. And in 1991, that's the same year as that incident, she's removed from service. Could you imagine if that was a nuclear missile? Even if it didn't detonate, but it just broke apart, you would have nuclear material everywhere. K22, the Red Guard. Red Guard is an honorary name for K22. Okay, in August 1965, she becomes operational. In September 1965, the next month, she joins the Northern Fleet. In 1966, the next year, she's on her first deployment in the Norwegian Sea. No events. Returns home. In 1967, she's given that Red Guard name. In 1968 to 70, she conducts 3 annual deployments to the Atlantic with no incidents. She returns to port in 1971 to 75. She goes into refit and overhaul in a dry dock. Typical 4-year period. That usually includes a refuel whenever it's that long. But in August 1976, everything changes. In the Mediterranean, K-22 strikes the USS Vogue, which is a frigate, with its sail in the port quarter, the rear port quarter where the aircraft hangar is, about 150 miles southwest of Ceuta Bay, Crete. So what happened here was the captain wanted to run a drill with his crew and run at an American warship steaming in the Mediterranean from a broached condition. And you can see a picture of it right there. Sail sticking out of the water. They're doing a flank bell as fast as they can. They have the periscope raised. And his intention is to get very close to the American ship and cause the American ship to change course. That's the tactic here. No ship wants to ram. Any ship made out of aluminum, like an American warship, is not going to win a fight against a steel hull. So she expects the ship to move. Of course, the American ship holds its ground, stays on its course, and the submarine plows its bow first into the port quarter of the frigates, followed very quickly by the sail itself, just rams right into the rear end of the frigate. And this is all caught on image with multiple photographers on the frigate. So officially, the Soviets blamed the U.S. for the frigate, for the collision, because they didn't get out of the way, is the idea there. Of course, America blames the Soviets for acting reckless. This goes on throughout the Cold War. Okay, and incidents like this happen even today. If you watch the news, occasionally you'll hear of Russian ships coming very close to our ships in the Med, in the Black Sea, wherever, all around the globe. This is a very common tactic. And sometimes it ends in collision like it did here. Even though some sailors on the ship were thrown overboard, they were immediately recovered, so nobody was severely injured or any loss of anybody. But it did do severe damage to the bow and sail of the submarine, as well as the frigate had to return to port for repairs. Here's the picture of the K22 Topside Damage. You can see how the starboard side of the bow of the submarine hit the ship first, and then a major impact on the sail completely wrecked the target data radar that's there on the bow. So she essentially took herself out of the fight, as well as taking the frigate out with this idiotic ram. K-22 Red Guard, she returns to sea from 1978 to 85 after this collision. She returns to the Med every year until 1985. In 1985, she is modernized to Project 675 MKV, which is the one we just talked about. She gets all those upgrades, and in June 1992, her honorary name Red Guard is removed because now she is no longer the Soviet Union, and that was a Soviet Union reference. And she is renamed B-22, Bravo 22. 2 years later, in 1994, she is eventually removed from service. Here you can see a picture of her on the surface after the collision. Looks like she's getting a tow there, with her sail completely damaged and a lot of damage to the bow as well on the starboard side. So K-22, everybody. Now we're going to talk about K-35. K-35 became operational in June 1965 and joined the Northern Fleet in July 1965. In December 1965, Yuri Gagarin visits the ship, calls it a very fine warship. It's a big PR stunt. It's good for Yuri. He seemed to enjoy himself. He met a number of people of the crew, including the captain and the admiral of the squadron. And it was a big PR event that the first man in space is coming to meet the submariners that have similar challenges to space flight, but underwater. In 1966, she does her first deployment to the Norwegian Sea. In 1967 to 68, she conducts missile testing for 2 years. The average over those 2 years is a 70% success rate, like what we talked about before. So an average of about 6 out of these 8 total missiles they expect to actually work. In 1973 to 74, she does deploy to the Atlantic. In March of 1974, a high-pressure air reducer fails and causes a fire, but there's no injuries this time. December 1975, there's high hydrogen in the battery, and it explodes, injuring 2 sailors. So the battery well, if it's not properly ventilated, can get too much hydrogen, and then it's very easy for a fire to start there. And sometimes that fire is simply an explosion, as in this case. This happens commonly when you're charging the battery, but it's not clear if that's what was going on in this case. Anyway, almost 10 years later, after this battery explosion, she gets modernized to Project 675 MKV. After the modernization is over, she goes on her final deployment from 1988 to 89. It's not a year-long deployment. It just happens over the winter time there, which is a rare deployment for them out of the north. And she comes back after that. And she's renamed B-35 in 1992. And in 1993, the next year, she's removed from service. K90 or K111. She has both names. K90 is operational in September 1965. In October 1965, she joins the Northern Fleet. In 1967 to 70, she conducts annual deployments to the Atlantic. So this is a good start for her career. She gets done with sea trials. She joins the fleet. She's doing missions. Everything's fine. In 1975, she performs rocket tests, which are essentially missile tests with exercise warheads. And she is renamed K111 in 1978. She doesn't have any modifications at this time. They simply change the name of the submarine, which reinforces my belief that they do this to try and confuse intelligence gathering organizations. Because nothing happens to the submarine significantly or technically in 1978, but she does get this new name. In 1979, a drip leak is found in the primary loop. The loop is shut down, and she completes her mission with the other reactor. Now, I should mention this now. We noticed during the Cold War, the Russians or the Soviet Union would go to sea and they would only use one side of their engine room. And we thought this was a tactic because obviously the engine room is a lot quieter if you're only using half of it. If you have half the machinery running, that's a lot less noise than all the machinery running. And it was effective. You know, if you went around on one screw instead of 2, you would make less noise. You know, and the Echo 2 was a very loud boat. So making less noise is always a good thing for her. Well, it turns out a lot of the times they were running around with one screw turning instead of 2, not as a tactical employment, but because they had maintenance problems. Half of the engine room was shut down. They couldn't turn both screws. So there was a little bit of both going on here. It was probably a tactic that they did employ at times because it worked. And it was probably because of maintenance issues the other times. In 1980 to 85, she deploys annually, year after year, to the Mediterranean. Very successful, no problems. Again, the reason why we know all this is because we're watching them do it. You know, we're following them down to the Med, we follow them around the Med, we follow them home again, and then we go home ourselves. October 1985, a steam generator is found leaking contaminated water, so they shut down the steam generator and they complete the deployment in 1985 again with half the engine room working. In 1986, the very next year, she completes her final deployment to the Atlantic, and in 1989, she's removed from service. So she spent a lot of her time on deployment, completing her mission, but with severe problems and limitations in the engine room. All right, K116. K116 is built by Sevmash, okay? We're still with Severodvinsk, Russia, you know, the west face of Russia facing the Atlantic, building K116 in 1965. She joins the Northern Fleet in November 1965. But in February 1966, she transits to her new home port in the Pacific Fleet via the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage is the small body of water south of Argentina and Peru. Between Antarctica and South America, that body of water is the Drake Passage. So she goes all the way through the Atlantic. She does this submerged, by the way. She doesn't surface the entire time. She comes to periscope depth for radio traffic and whatnot, but she does not surface. All the way down through the Atlantic, through the Drake Passage, and all the way back up to the northern Pacific to Vladivostok, which is that peninsula west of Alaska, but on Russian territory, where she pulls into port months later. It's a major accomplishment to have submerged transit halfway across the globe without surfacing. That is a huge achievement, even today, but especially in 1965. So 1966 to 69, she begins to conduct deployments in the Pacific. These aren't necessarily the annual deployments we see coming out of the Northern Fleet, because the Northern Fleet is iced in for a couple months a year, usually December to February, somewhere in that time frame. The ice pack freezes so much they can't physically get to sea without risking, running into ice and, damaging their ship just trying to go to sea. But on the Pacific side, they are not iced in. So they don't necessarily have that annual rotation. They just go to sea as they need to go to sea. So during these 3 years, she conducts multiple deployments of various lengths to the Pacific. In 1973, she deploys all the way down to the Indian Ocean and visits Somalia, which during the Cold War, Somalia was kind of a puppet state supported by Russia, Soviet Union, and the Eastern Bloc. That was just one of their regular port visits, like there, Egypt, Algeria, all around the globe. In 1976, she collides with a small motor ship in Avacha Bay, damaging the main ballast tanks, and she dry docks for a year to repair that. Now, that Avacha Bay is right outside the port, so it's possible that she was returning or going to sea whenever this occurred in 1976. 3 years later, July 1979, while surface transiting out of port, the primary coolant began leaking out of the reactor cover. This sprayed radioactive liquid throughout the entire compartment, and because it was aerosol, got into the ventilation system, and heat rose due to the coolant loss, which created even more pressure and heat, causing more steam and more contamination. The reactor was eventually scrammed by the operator, but the ventilation was never properly isolated, and the entire submarine from compartment 1 to compartment 10 was completely contaminated with radiation. All the sailors, the equipment, every surface, it was a mess in 1979. In 1982, due to the condition of the submarine, after trying to clean this thing up for 3 years, the General Staff sent K116 to the reserve fleet. They're like, you're not decommissioned, but you're also not going to sea anymore. We're just going to keep you in standby mode just in case we lose every other submarine and we need somebody to go to sea, that you're going to be that boat now. And that's where she stood for the rest of her career. In 2005, over 2 decades later, they finally just disbanded the crew. Radiation levels were still high in all compartments in 2005. In 2009, unable to defuel the reactor because of the damage, it had partially melted inside the vessel, so they couldn't get it out normally. The reactor was instead filled with cement and preserved that way and moved into long-term storage. K116 was a mess. Okay, 125, December in 1965, she's operational and joins the Northern Fleet, all in the same month. 1966, she deploys to the Atlantic for 50 days, which is a typical deployment. Good start to her career. In 1967 to 70, annual deployment to the Mediterranean Sea, those 3 years. In 1970 to 74, she is modernized to Project 675K. She's the second ship to get that modernization, and you can see the bulging sail right there. This photo is after the modernization has taken place. The following year, after she's modernized, she deploys to the Med and participates in war games in the Atlantic called Ocean 75. In 1977 to 83, she deploys every year routinely to the Med, where we see her participate, not only alone, but also with Russian vessels in the Med, just like what we're doing. The 1984 to 1987, she goes into a 3-year dry dock, refuel, and overhaul of the ship. Gets, some upgrades, but nothing really major. Still has the same capabilities as Project 675K. In 1988, she annually deploys to the Med for the next 3 years, so 88, 89, and 90, where in 1991, she's removed from service, but not decommissioned. 1992, she gets the new name Bravo 125, Small Submarine 125. And in 2005, she's moved to dry dock for decommissioning. And in 2011, her reactor was removed for long-term storage. So this submarine was safely decommissioned without any major problems. Probably the most successful Echo tour we're going to talk about today, K125. K128 is August 1966. She becomes operational and joins the fleet the next month in September. The following year, March 1967, she participates in Equal Expedition for Special Purpose. So what this is an endurance test under high heat, high stress, high humidity conditions of the missile system and the crew. So what they do is they transit her down in March, the end of spring and coming into summer months, down to the equator off the coast of Africa's west coast. In May 1967, she moors to a tender at sea off the coast of Africa. The sea state increases one day and it rips the anchor free from the bottom, which happens sometimes. But in the process, because she's tied to a ship when this happens, the main ballast tank 5 becomes damaged, slamming into the side of the ship repeatedly. But she's still tied to the ship, so she's fine. She's not sinking or anything. The next month, she's underway. Presumably, the main ballast tank is repaired at this point. An electrician opened both port and starboard electrical buses at the same time, which essentially powers down the entire submarine. You never open both at the same time, but someone managed to do that. Because there's no power in the submarine, the reactor's safety mechanisms kick in and scram the reactors, which shut down the reactors. This leaves them on battery power only, so battery power kicks in and provides some emergency lighting and electricity to essential systems throughout the submarine. The submarine was submerged when this happened, so they come up to periscope depth, they surface, they begin snorkeling with their diesel, the diesel generator providing more power so the battery doesn't get depleted. On reactor restart, the coolant feed pumps failed and both reactors overtempped. So they're starting up the reactors went terribly wrong, both of them. Both reactors scrammed again, and upon investigation, they're trying to figure out why the feed pumps weren't working right. The operator had lined up the feed pump in reverse. So instead of feeding the water properly, it was taking water away from the system or in the reverse direction. It's a closed loop. So even the reverse direction goes to the same place, but it goes the wrong way. And there's check valves in place to keep water from going the wrong way, essentially stopping water flow from the feed pump system. And they also found a rag with the Sevmash shipyard insignia on the rag itself. So somebody from the shipyard had left a rag in one of the feed pump pipes, and it wasn't detected until 1967, a year after she was commissioned. So a lot of things went wrong there in 1967, including almost ruining the reactors. But she gets all that sorted out. The reactors are working now in 1968 to 1970. She deploys 4 times in 3 years, kind of making up and atoning for her past. In 1973, she conducts successful missile test with the P6 missile. On August 1973, she ran aground on a reef off the coast of Cuba, presumably not the same reef the other submarine had hit, and had to wait for high tide before they could get pushed off. So she didn't need to get towed off. High tide came in, pushed her off the reef, and she was fine. But the bow sonar and the torpedo tubes were damaged, so she couldn't use them. She had to return to port and get repaired. In 1977, she does get the upgrade to Project 675 MK. We've already talked about that. So in 1982, she's renamed K22, probably related to the modernization she just received. So in this case, renaming the submarine makes sense. It is the same hull with new capabilities. She has a new name. In 1983 to 1988, she deployed 7 times without incident. And in 1989, she is removed from service, not decommissioned, so she gets a new name, B-62, in 1992. And then she is removed from service after that and decommissioned. All right, so K-131, she's operational in September 1966. She joins the Northern Fleet the very next month. 5th of July, 1967, the next year, she's deployed to the Mediterranean Sea, and the captain is told to be ready to strike targets in Israel. This is during the Six-Day War with Israel, when she's deployed to the Med. The only reason why she's not engaged in Israel during the Six-Day War is she never made it to her launch point before the war ended. The war ended before she got in position to fire. So even though these cruise missiles are designed to sink ships, and presumably that would have been her target with some sort of Israeli ship, they were nuclear capable and they could shoot them in the direction of a city as well. But thankfully, the war ended after 6 days, which probably stopped the Israeli Six-Day War from escalating into a very hot war between Russia, Israel, and its allies, including the United States. K-131 had orders to be ready to fire on Israel, and the only reason why it didn't is it didn't get there in time. In June 1962, years later, during a surface transit, she collides with a Charlie-class submarine, K-320, causing minor damage to both submarines. Both submarines need to pull in and get repaired. In 1972 to 84, 12 years of annual deployments to the Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean without incident. This is the longest time an Echo 2 hull will operate without an incident, 12 years. So kudos to K-131 for finally figuring it out. In June 1984, on day 61 of the deployment, so they had been out for a long time, they're returning to port, a fire breaks out in the engine room and it spreads rapidly, burning several sailors. So whatever caught on fire out there caught on fire and spread before people could get out of the way. The fire was fought with water for 20 minutes while crew were rescued. And then that Freon extinguishing system was used to put the fire out the rest of the way. 21 sailors died fighting this fire. It is a huge catastrophe for the Soviet Union. One of the largest loss of life at any one time on a nuclear submarine in history happened in 1984 on K-131. 1984 to 89, in dry dock for refuel and repairs. She does not deploy again after that. Those repairs were never finished. In 1992, she does get renamed B-131 and is finally removed from service after that, as they simply can't afford to keep her at this point. That's after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they just have no money at this point. K-135, again, being built up in Sevmash shipyard in Severnensk, Russia. It's November 1966. She's operational and joins the Northern Fleet the very next month in December. In 1967, she deploys to the Atlantic and finds U.S. SSBN 599 Patrick Henry, and she successfully trails with active sonar a U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarine for 6 hours. This is a major achievement. They get lots of awards for doing this. This is the first time the Echo 2 has done this. It's tracked an American SSBN, and this is confirmed with American sonar logs that are unclassified, that they had active sonar from Pikejaw Sonar for more than 6 hours, but it's feasible that they tracked her for 6 hours. In 1970, she visits Cuba with the task force of Soviet ships, like the Tender and whatnot, and probably a tugboat or two to pull her off a reef in case she hits one, but she doesn't. To her credit, K-135 did not hit a reef off Cuba this time. 7 years later, 1977, she's in a refuel and repair and dry dock. That takes a few years. And then she comes out. In October 1981, the astral navigation system was broken, so the sub, during submerged operations, was dead reckoning its position manually. And that's where the quartermaster simply plots the position of the last known position and then calculates, if we're doing 10 knots to the east, our new position after 10 minutes must be here. The problem with doing that over time for long periods of time is that slowly becomes more or less and less accurate. So the quartermaster had fixed the position and put high confidence positions because he can rate his own position. He gave himself high confidence for over a long enough period of time. And the navigation officer never questioned his high confidence dead reckoning over many days, which of course he should have. There's no way, no matter how good of a quartermaster you are, you're not going to have some error in your dead reckoning, especially after a long period of time. Well, the navigator, it appears, never even checked the log. So the ship was not using the fathometer when suddenly it ran aground. What had happened was the bottom was slowly coming up at a slow angle. And sonar begins reporting as the submarine hit the bottom at 10 knots. Sonar says, hey, we have loud noise in all directions. We don't know what's going on. The ship is shaking a little bit, but it's not stopping. They didn't hit anything hard enough to feel like a collision. They just felt a rumbling and have a loud noise in sonar and a very confident quartermaster saying everything's fine. They continue like this for 15 minutes, dragging, plowing, really, the bow of the submarine through the sandy bottom of the Mediterranean. Before the captain finally stops this, orders a surface and a fixed position. They find that they're 30 miles from where they think they are. So from that, the navigator and the quartermaster were dealt with. In 1989, she's moved to the reserve fleet. And in 1992, she's renamed B-135 and removed from service the same year. And that is the conclusion of the Sevmash shipyard. Now we're going to shift gears to the Pacific. The Komsomolets-Amur shipyard, they're on the eastern side of Russia, facing the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean. At the same time that these events are happening, this shipyard is also building submarines, Echo 2s, for the Pacific Fleet. In December 1963, we're going all the way back to 1963 now, K175 is operational with exceptions. This is common for the shipyard, as the shipyard's quality of work is a lot lower than Sevmash, as we'll find out here. In November 1963, she does join the Pacific Fleet based out of the Kamchatka Peninsula. In 1964 to 66, she does conduct sea testing for 3 years. This is normal because it's the first hull of this type of submarine to be built by this shipyard. Having an extended sea trial period is not uncommon. In 1968, though, cracks in the reactor vessel limit power to 40%, and this is insane. If you have cracks in the reactor vessel, not only do you limit power to zero, but you replace it. You pull it out and you put a new one in. And instead of doing that, instead of repairing it, instead of patching it, they said, no, it's okay. Just limit power to only 40%. 5 years later, she's modernized to Project 675MK, which we've already talked about. Presumably in this time, she is refueled with a new reactor vessel. In 1979, she deploys for the first time for 55 days. About 15 years after she was initially built, she conducts her first mission. In 1980, though, she does deploy all the way around to the Red Sea. That's on the other side of Saudi Arabia from her home port. So a very long deployment, demonstrating the capability of, we have global reach with these nuclear capable P6, P500 missiles on this Echo 2 submarine. This is a real message to NATO in 1980 that, hey, these Echoes are something to pay attention to. And to NATO's credit, we are watching them. They are a dangerous nuclear capable weapons platform. In 1985, she's off the coast of Ethiopia. That's in Africa. When rapid depressurization of the reactor containment compartment begins, the reactor is scrammed immediately and she's returned to port. But this incident is never reported beyond the Admiralty. The Admiralty clamps down on this because a lot of nuclear incidences are happening right now with other Echo 2s and the Russian submarine fleet in general. They have a history of a lot of nuclear incidents. This specific incident was never reported until years later. years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did this incident become available to the public. In 1988, the reactor repair begins. In 1989, the reactor is refueled, but halted due to the lack of funds. Again, it's 1989. Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse at this time. They have no money. And in 1990, she's removed from service and partially dismantled with a partially dismantled reactor vessel. In other words, they were working on the reactor when they decided to stop. So it's in this condition of not quite operational and not quite safe or decommissioned. It's somewhere in between when they just stop working on her. 2 years later, she's given a new name, Bravo 175, because why not? They haven't decommissioned her yet. She's technically still in the Pacific Fleet. In 1992, she sinks next to the pier, which is really bad because that reactor in its current state isn't watertight. So the seawater from the flooding gets into the reactor and contaminates everything. Everything gets contaminated. Everybody's got radiation now, all the compartments. So in 1994, the same year, the sub is raised up next to the pier and disposed of with 5 compartments attached. So imagine the submarine has 10 compartments, 1 through 10, going from the forward to the rear end. The middle 5 remain as one unit, and the middle 5 are cut out and sent into long-term storage where it sits today because of the contamination. Yeah, K175 was a mess. Okay, K184, March 1964, she's operational. She becomes part of the Pacific Fleet in November of the same year. Again, a little bit of a delay there. Notice how out of the Sevmast shipyard in Northern Fleet, she's operational and deploying within a month. Not the case in the Pacific Fleet. After she's operational, quotes, air quotes, she still has months of testing before she joins the Pacific Fleet. In this case, about 6 or 7 months. In 1964, though, to 67, she does deploy 3 times to the Pacific. So she begins her operational routine in the late 60s. In 1971, in the Sea of Okhotsk, the radioactive gas is released in the reactor compartment. It quickly spreads to the surrounding compartments via the ventilation. We've seen this happen before in this class of submarine. There is a problem with crew training, or the ventilation cannot be isolated fast enough to prevent this from happening. The captain surfaces the submarine and ventilates the radioactive air out of the submarine as fast as he can. But guess what's up there on the surface? An American P-3 Orion ASW aircraft appears from over the horizon and circles the submarine for hours. So the captain, because he doesn't want to be detected by the P-3, but has this nuclear radiation casualty on board, decides to close up all the hatches, secure surface ventilating, and dive the ship with high radiation everywhere. He orders a return to port submerge. The entire crew suffers massive radiation poisoning and has symptoms for over a month. I'm sure there were deaths involved, but public record, or the only record that we have of this, says that the crew suffered radiation poisoning symptoms, including headache and nausea, for 30 days. I'm sure it was worse than that, but that's the public record. In 1975 to 78, they did modernize to Project 675MK. Took 3 years for that modernization. In March 1981, she collides with a Charlie-class submarine, K-43. Torpedo tubes are damaged, and the captain in this case is dismissed. He is saddled with, it's his responsibility. The collision, of which I don't have any details, happened because of his actions, not the Charlie submarine's actions, and he is dismissed. And in the Soviet Union, being dismissed is usually much more than a simple being fired. Okay, in 1983 to 1986, she deploys 3 more times to the Pacific with a new captain. In 1988, she used, there's an electrical power plant. She's used as an electrical power plant for shore facilities in the villages. So this is one of a couple submarines that will end up being used like this. On the eastern side of Russia, the Kamchatka Peninsula, that entire region over there is, part of Siberia and kind of no man's land. And they don't always have the infrastructure that they have on the European side of Russia. Russia's a huge country. Okay. So, on the eastern face of Russia, facing the Pacific and the Sea of Japan, sometimes they don't always have electrical power available. But these nuclear submarines, as dangerous as they are, can provide limited amounts of electrical power to the power grid. So in 1988, she's used basically as a pier-side power plant to the local power grid. Now, they can't supply a lot of electricity, but it's better than no electricity to some facilities. There are severe limitations on how much power that they can produce. I should note that even American submarines can do this. We have infrastructure here in the United States. In the event of a huge catastrophe where we lose part of the power grid, we can use some of our nuclear vessels, whether they're surface ships or submarines, to provide limited emergency electrical power to places like hospitals and other things that are on the electrical grid. Don't expect your home to be powered by the same power grid that's going to the hospital, though. It's not going to happen. All right, in 1988, that's when that goes on. 1990, she's finally removed from service of being a power plant. She's not retired, so she gets the new name in 1992 of Bravo 184. And then finally in June 1990, we have photo evidence of a reactor compartment is in long-term storage. So sometime between 92 and 2019, she was cut up for razor blades and is safely stowed away. All right, K189. All right, K189 is operational in July 1965 and joins the fleet 1 month later. In 1966 to 68, she deploys 2 times to the Pacific. She goes through a refit and overhaul in 1969 to 71. In 1971, she does sound test and does manage to collide with the recording ship. In this case, the sound test was simply between her and a surface ship that had a hydrophone in the water, and she got a little too close to the hydrophone, ended up colliding with that ship, damaging the sail. In 1975, she deploys to the Indian Ocean, demonstrating her capability and global reach. In 1976 to 89, a 6-year period, she is modernized to Project 675MK. She gets those upgrades, including that P500 missile, right? More capable supersonic missile. And she comes out of that modernization with a new name, K144. She deploys in 1984 and 1987 to the Pacific, and she's removed from service in 1991, has her name changed in 1992 to B144. In November 2019, her reactor compartment was verified in long-term storage. So sometime between 1992 and 2019, she was cut up. Notice how there's no public record between those 2 dates. Again, that's the I want to say the West Coast out mentality, but it's actually East Coast for Russia. That's just how they roll. They're fast and loose and have a lower level of quality assurance, lower level of QA and quality of work out of this shipyard, including record keeping, apparently. Okay, K57, October 1965, she's operational. She joins the fleet the next month in November. From 1965 to 68, she deploys to the Pacific. She pulls in 1969 to 71 through a refit and overhaul, and immediately deploys again to the Pacific until 1975. This is 10 years of proper submarine employment, over many crews, over many captains. They do a good job here. K57 is the first submarine on the Pacific coast to really show how a crew and submarine should be led. This is well done. But in 1975, the Freon fire extinguisher system is enabled by accident, flooding a compartment with Freon, displacing the oxygen and killing 2 sailors before they could be evacuated out of the compartment. In 1976 to 79, she is modernized to the Project 675MK and is renamed K557. In 1980, during a torpedo firing exercise with Rear Admiral Shevnin observing, the captain identified the target ship at periscope depth. The captain was too close to the target ship, so he turned around, and instead of going away from the target ship like he intended to, he actually got onto the target ship's course and allowed the target ship to catch up to him and run over his sail, not damaging or hitting him, but run right by the submarine, so that whenever he turned back into where he thought the target should be, he didn't have a visual target. But because he wanted to complete the weapons test, he launched the exercise torpedo anyway, and that torpedo ended up running up onto a beach. because this happened right off the coast of Vladivostok. So they were able to recover the torpedo. They sent a crew out there to pick it up off the beach, but the crew and the captain were given an unsatisfactory grade for the torpedo exercise by the admiral. Just poor ship driving, and he never should have launched that weapon. Okay, 1982 to 1989, they complete 3 deployments in the Pacific with the new captain. In 1989, they're used as an electrical power plant again for shore sites. You know, this is the second Echo to have this happen to them. You know, remarkably, they're more successful as an electrical power plant than they are as a submarine at this point. In 1992, they were removed from service and renamed B557. And in 2009, her reactor department is in temporary holding facility. I don't have an update past then. Presumably by now she would be in a permanent storage, but we don't know that. All right, K31. K31's a mess. K31 is operational in 1965. In November 1965, she joins the Pacific Fleet. And from 66 to 68, she conducts deployments to the Pacific. One of her steam generator fails on one of these deployments, but she's able to finish the deployment and come home on the other side of the engine room working only. Again, we think they're trying to be quiet. They simply only have half their submarine working. In 1969 to 71, overhaul and steam generator is complete. It takes a couple years because it's an overhaul too. It's not just a steam generator repair. And she deploys to the Indian Ocean in 1972. This is a major deployment. That's a long ways to go and come back. So very successful deployment to the Indian Ocean. In 1976, 80 to 81, she deploys 4 times and suffers major electrical failures. So the thing with K31 is there's something wrong with her electrical bus ship-wide. She's always having shorts, losses of power, blowing fuses. There's grounds everywhere. Grounds on a floating bus are very bad because a zero ground on a floating bus heats up rapidly and can cause a fire. It also, obviously, the electricity is not getting to where it needs to go. So you have equipment that doesn't work and a possible fire starting over here. So, but she deals with this for years. And the crew is just basically doing patchwork repairs, isolating these little problems, these little grounds, and getting the electricity to the equipment that it needs to get to. She's renamed K431 in 1978. In 1981 to 82, she dry docks for 2 years to repair that electrical bus and countless other things. In 1983, she deploys in 84 for 193 days over 18 months. This is getting back to the rotation that I was talking about in the Pacific. They don't have an annual cycle like they have in the Atlantic side because of the weather. Here, they're not limited by ice. They can go to sea whenever they want, much like the American fleet. So they do. And this has a high tempo for 2 years, 18 months, she goes to sea for long periods of time before returning to port. So she has a good run in this time. But in August 1985, while refueling the reactor, so she's in dry dock, having a reactor refueled, the vessel cover is lifted, and that is the reactor vessel cover is lifted too far and too fast, and the fuel rods that are attached to the cover, because it's a bad design, come out of the fuel too fast, which causes the reactor to go critical, which radiates everybody immediately, but it also causes an overpressurization in the reactor vessel. We saw this happen on the November class. Same engine room, different class of submarine, same incident. But in this case, that steel reactor vessel that holds nuclear fuel explodes like a hand grenade, kills the entire work team immediately. Pieces of radioactive fuel are found outside the submarine, covering other submarines up to 150 meters away. Obviously, there's a huge fire, lots of smoke. It is a huge radioactive incident. The reactor compartment was flooded with seawater from other ships and fire hoses from the pier to just try to contain the radiation, much less put the fire out. Over 950 people were contaminated with radiation poisoning and showed signs of radiation poisoning. That number is probably higher, but that's the public number. Those that were killed were cremated in a special crematorium as not to contaminate, regular crematoriums, I guess, and buried in a mass grave. The death toll was never made public, but I assume that it was very, very high. They essentially wrecked the submarine while trying to refuel it. In 1986, just a few months later, but the next year, the reactor compartment was filled with cement, the entire reactor compartment, and moved into long-term storage. They could not salvage the submarine after the reactor vessel blew nuclear fuel all over the port. In 2011, the reactor compartment is floating in a long-term storage in Razbanik Bay in Russia. A mess. K31, everybody. K48, December 1965, she's operational. The next month, in January 1966, she joins the fleet. In 1967, while on deployment in the Philippine Sea, she tracks the U.S. Bainbridge and conducts a mock torpedo attack, and then surfaces and conducts a mock missile attack for 30 minutes, presumably a 2-salvo attack. So this gave us insight into their tactics. It looked like the way they intended on employing the Echo 2 was to first fire torpedoes and then surface and fire the missiles for as long as they could without being destroyed, hoping that even if the missiles failed, the torpedoes would clean up anything that the missiles may not have sunk. So that was their tactic, we presume, was torpedoes first, a covert attack, because it's likely we wouldn't hear the torpedo launch if they're far enough away, and then come to the surface where they would guide their missiles. And I need to talk a little bit, because I don't think I've done this yet, about how they would employ their missiles. They would come to the surface, they would raise the launchers and get the missiles ready. While that's going on, they would rotate that main target radar that's on the bow of the sail around and start radiating, looking for targets. Assuming they didn't get target data from another aircraft, they would have to find the target themselves, which takes some time. And after they find the target, presumably an American carrier, surrounded by escorts, they would lock on to the largest target, presumably the carrier, and that's where they would aim the radar beam. They would then launch up to 4 missiles at a time towards that one target, homing in on that one radar beam. Down inside the submarine, each missile would have a designated operator at a missile control station where he could monitor the missile's guidance and the radar beam on a display. And he would make sure that they lined up. If they ever deviated left or right, he could steer the missile horizontally. He couldn't change the altitude of the missile, but he could change the missile left and right to make sure that it stayed on that radar beam if it didn't stay on it itself. And then once it got to its enable point, each missile would turn on its own radar and home itself in. Once it did that, the operator didn't have control over it anymore. But there was limited manual control of the P6 and P500 missiles in flight. Again, in the 1960s, this is very advanced stuff, that the missiles are not only talking to each other, or they're also talking to an operator back on the submarine. The problem with this is the submarine is surfaced the entire time. That submarine is not going to live 12 minutes or even 30 minutes. It's going to be blown out of the water as it's conducting this attack. And that's a major vulnerability. The Russians know this, but they don't have a better design yet. All right. So after she conducts that, mock missile attack, while on deployment, the ship's mechanic, I guess celebrating, breaks out a bottle of alcohol in the engine room. This is the same deployment where they went to the Philippine Sea, and begins to drink approximately half a liter of hard liquor of an unknown type between him and the ship's doctor. They're celebrating back in compartment 10, having a high old time whenever he begins to have chest pains, the mechanic does, and drunk off his butt, the doctor begins to perform CPR on the drunk mechanic who is on the ground now, grabbing his chest. To the doctor's credit, as inebriated as he was, he saves the mechanic's life. Whether or not it was an actual heart attack or a panic attack, we don't know, or some kind of reaction to some poorly made liquor. That was the more likely the case. But these two guys, drooling drunk, were trying to save each other from what appears to be a heart attack. Anyway, in 1970 to 73, the ship is refueled and overhauled and modernized to Project 675K. In 1976 to 78, she deploys to the Indian Ocean and doesn't return to the Indian Ocean until 1985. So there's a little bit of a break in there. So here you may be wondering what's going on between these breaks. That's almost 7 years between the Indian Ocean deployment and the second one. Well, in that time, there's a lot of maintenance that goes on. These ships sometimes don't leave port for a very long period of time. It can be over a year. And they can also do what's called local patrols, where they may just go out into the Bering Sea for a few weeks. They stay busy. It's not like the ship isn't doing anything for 7 years. They're just not on a major deployment for 7 years. That's what goes on in those time gaps. All right, now we're at 1987. She deploys to the Pacific with no problems. And in 1990, she's removed from service, but not decom, so she gets her new name in 1992 to B-48. In 2007, her reactor compartment is in long-term storage in Robber Bay. Now, Robber Bay I couldn't find on the map, so that may be a mistranslation, but the Russian word translates to English as robber. But it could be Rudder Bay, it could be something like that. Either way, the important part is that the reactor is in storage safely. All right, K56 again. We're talking Pacific Ocean, Pacific Fleet here. She's operational in August 1966 and joins the fleet in September. In 1967, she does a successful test of the P-6 missile. In 1969, she deploys to the Sea of Japan, which is right around the corner from the base. Not a very far to go to get there. In 1963, she's testing the P-6 missile system when she collides with the missile tracking ship that's supposed to be tracking the freaking missile launch. Unfortunately, and this part isn't funny, kills 27 sailors on the ship. It's a major collision. It's huge. There's also damage to the submarine, where some of these sailors on the submarine were part of the 27, presumably. She flooded compartments 1 and 2, which is like the torpedo room, and then right behind that, some electrical equipment. The battery number 1 is up in that compartment that could short and cause a fire. It's a mess. Large number of deaths, the single largest number since the nuclear incident that happened with the other Echo 2, killing over 20 sailors there. So these Echo 2s are very dangerous. They kill a lot of people. And she returns to port in 1973. In 1978, a crack is discovered in the bottom of the reactor vessel, leaking coolant. Learning from mistakes from the past, which happens, they repair this. They don't go to sea. They don't limit themselves on power to 40%. They actually repair the reactor vessel this time in 1978. In 1979, she gets the upgrade to Project 675MK. So we've already talked about that. We're not going to go over it again, but she gets the equipment upgrade, including that P500 missile, which is the biggest part of that upgrade. And the reactor is replaced because it's leaking coolant everywhere. 1988, she deploys to the Pacific with no incidents. In 1992, she's renamed B-56 and removed from service the same year. In 2008, her reactor compartment is in temporary storage in Robber Bay, Russia. Again, the Robber Bay may be Rudder Bay. All right, K10, October 1966, she's operational and joins Pacific Fleet in the same month. First time that's happened on this side of the world. In 1967 and 1970, she does 3 deployments into the Pacific. One of those deployments, she tracks the USS Enterprise for 13 hours, the whole battle group. So good job, her. 10 years later, 1979, while charging the battery, an electrician got drunk and went to bed while he's charging the battery. What the electrician should be doing during a battery charge is taking readings every 15 minutes of the hydrogen level in the battery compartment. That's what he does. That's the responsibility of the electrician conducting the battery charge. The reason for that is high amounts of hydrogen in a small space or the same space can cause an explosion. Well, it's never happened before, so he thought it'd be okay to drink and go to bed. What happened was the ventilation fans that were working fine when he went to bed blew a fuse. So the ventilation fans, and there's 2 of them, failed. They stopped moving air over the top of the battery. So the hydrogen being emitted from the battery as it's taking on a charge to recharge it begins to build up, and it's not moving because the fans aren't running. And without anybody noticing, because nobody's taking the readings, the battery compartment explodes. Battery compartment 1 explodes, destroying 25 battery cells, ripping up the deck, ripping the door off the ship's doctor's office as if he hasn't had enough. He gets this now, injuring several crewmen and waking one hungover electrician. Luckily, there weren't any deaths. In 1983, while underway in the Pacific, it ran into an unknown object and surfaced. This is an interesting story. In 1983, they are not just in the Pacific, but they are near Taiwan. So in the vicinity of the Philippine Sea, the Taiwan Strait, it's not exactly clear where they were, but they were in that region. And they're submerged. And we don't know exactly the depth, but below periscope depth. And they run into something hard. It's clear they hit something. It bong. It wasn't an animal. It was metallic, but they don't know what it was. They surface and there's nobody around. There's no ship. There's no nothing. So they radio it like they're supposed to do. They're following the rules. They pull back into port and they find metal stuck in the top side of the ship. This is a different kind of metal than what K-10 is made out of. So they definitely hit a metallic object. But they didn't see anybody on the surface whenever they went up. It turns out that it ended up being a Chinese submarine. And the only way we figured this out was about 2 years later, the Chinese state-controlled media came out with a list of crew names and the submarine that was lost in the vicinity of the K-10's patrol area. So we put 2 and 2 together. We figured out K-10 hit this Chinese submarine and sank it, killing the entire crew, presumably. That's why they didn't have anybody topside whenever they surfaced. And because Russia and China never coordinated their submarine deployments, they never talked to each other. They didn't figure this out until this list of deceased names came out years later. Very sad story. So submarine collisions can end terribly, as they've happened here. In 1984, the very next year after this tragedy, she is modernized to Project 675 MKV, which is the full package. But then 5 years later, she's removed from service. So, and in 1996, her reactor is in storage in Russia, confirmed. All right. K94. December 1966, she's operational. In January 1967, she joins the fleet. From 67 to 72, she does deploy 5 times in the Pacific and immediately returns for modernization to Project 675 MK for 3 years, where she gets the new name in 1976 of K204. She then immediately deploys for 6 years, 6 times to the Pacific with no problems. Here we have an Echo 2 built by the Pacific or the Eastern shipyard, and she's deploying for decades without problems. This is great. In 1987, she dry docks for overhaul. The funding for that dry dock and overhaul in 1987 is never fully funded, so it never finishes. In 1991, they finally decide to stop the overhaul instead of just delaying it more and more. The ship hasn't been to sea in years at this point, and they remove her from service. Arguably the most successful Echo 2 in the Pacific at this point. In 1992, she does get the name B204 because she's not decommed yet. But between 1992 and 2009, she was decommed at some point because her reactor compartment is now in a temporary storage facility as of 2009. Hopefully by now she is in a more permanent facility. Okay, K108. In March 1967, she's operational. In November 1967, she joins the fleet. In 1968-69, she deploys to the Pacific 2 times without incident. K108, good start. In June 1970, she collides with the U.S. submarine Tautog SSN 639. The Tautog was slow and deep when they detected the Echo 2, because remember, the Echo 2s are very loud. The Americans continue monitoring the Echo 2 as it gets closer, but what the Americans can't tell is if she's above her or below her. The Tautog is already pretty deep, but they're not sure where she is. So they don't want to change depth. The Americans are like, we're not going to do this. So the K108 turns to a course that is very nearly paralleling the Tautog. But on the K108, there's no sonar record of a contact at this point. So it's just bad luck and coincidence that we have 2 submarines in close vicinity that are now driving the same direction at the same or near the same speed at an unknown depth. We don't know which one is a below or above the other. but they're almost right on top of each other. Now, this is a tactic the Americans use. This could possibly be intentional. This tactic has a name that I will not mention here, but it is possible that the Tautog was doing something very specific to the Echo 2 to put herself in this position. If that's the case, that's not public, and I can't talk about it now. But this may have been intentional from the American perspective. What was not intentional is what happened next. K108 changed depth from what was presumably periscope depth down to a deeper depth and came down right on top of the Tautog, smashing into the sail and the topside, damaging both submarines. Tautog's sail was damaged on her starboard side, and the crew, the screw from one of the shafts on the Echo 2 K108 was embedded and lodged into the sail of the Tautog. So when the Tautog went back to Pearl Harbor to repair herself, they found this huge part of it anyway, screw blade sticking out of the sail. So that became kind of an infamous trophy in Pearl Harbor, part of the Echo 2. But no injuries on both submarines. Everybody returned to port, and the Cold War continued. In 1979, repairs were complete for K108, and she deploys to the Indian Ocean, trying to show off that, hey, even a collision with an American submarine doesn't stop her from doing her job, even though it may be 9 years later. 1986, she deploys to the Pacific, and in 1988, she enters dry dock for refuel and repair. But again, they run out of money. They never finish the repair. She's removed from service in 1990, gets the new name B108 while in dry dock. She's not decommissioned, but she's not exactly funded for operation either. And her reactor is in temporary storage as of 2009. All right, K7. In September 1967, she's operational, and she joins the fleet the very next month in October. In 1968 to 72, she does 5 deployments to the Pacific, K7 does. In 1970, during those deployments, she successfully conducts tests of the P-6 missile. Again, verifying that her weapon systems do work about 70% of the time. In 1978 to 80, she goes in for overhaul and repair and comes out with a new name, K127. In 1983, 3 years later, she tracks the USS Nimitz during war games. And during war games, it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, because we put up exclusion areas of, hey, nobody come here. We kind of block off a part of the ocean that's rather large. And somewhere inside that block, a war game is going to happen. So the Russians, knowing this, drive one of their submarines, in this case, K127, into that exclusion area looking for the war game. And they found it in this case. Pretty easy to find. And they conduct their missile drills while tracking the USS Nimitz in 1983. In 1984 to 89, she goes into dry dock and refuel. But again, that's never completed because they run out of money. 1990, she's removed from service. And she's renamed B127 while in dry dock, unfunded. 2009, her reactor is in temporary storage at Razmanik Bay, Russia. And hopefully by now she's in permanent storage. All right, K23. K23, December 1967, she's operational. January 1968, she joins the Pacific Fleet. In 1969, she conducts missile tests with Admiral Fokin, a Kinda class missile cruiser. That's a picture of her right there if you're watching the video of this. In 1972 to 78, she deploys 6 times to the Pacific. So 10 years of good and faithful service to this point. In 1976, though, during these deployments, a fire does break out in Compartment 5. And instead of using the Freon extinguishers per procedure, the captain uses his brain and delays the employment of Freon to get the sailors out of Compartment 5 first. During the Cold War and during times like this, to keep that submarine operational, you would sometimes sacrifice a sailor or two to a fire to make sure the fire didn't spread. But the captain has the wherewithal to recognize, hey, let's get the sailors out of Compartment 5, seal Compartment 5, then flood Compartment 5 with the Freon, which is what he does, and it puts the fire out, and there's no injuries. So good job to the captain of K23 for saving his crew and his ship with the Freon system. And from 1978 to 84, they modernize in dry dock to Project 675MK. In 1985 to 88, they deploy 3 more times with the new modernizations on board to the Pacific, no problems. And in 1991, she's removed from service normally. She gets the name B-23 in 1992. And then her reactor is moved to temporary storage, verified in 2005. So at some point between 92 and 2005, she had been decommissioned. A pretty successful story, even though they had that fire. I like to see examples like this where captains are using their heads, not blindly following procedure to save lives. All right, K-34. K-34 is the final submarine in the Echo II fleet to be built out of for the Pacific Fleet. In December 1968, she goes operational. In January 1969, she joins the Pacific Fleet and deploys 6 times over the next 9 years into the Pacific. In 1979 to 1980, she goes into refit and overhaul and comes out with a new name, K-134. So she was K-34, now she's K-134. And in 1982 to 84, right after this refit and overhaul, she is modernized to Project 675 MKV, which is the full package. She gets the new radar system, the new satellite communication, new SM. She can shoot the P500 missiles. She can get the data from the helicopters and the airplanes. She's fully capable. She deploys with this full package from 1989 to 1993. Relatively recent compared to some of these other ones. Again, this is a Type 1 nuclear submarine. One of the first flights of nuclear submarines to be designed in the 50s is still deploying in 1993. So she deploys in the Pacific until 1993, where she is then removed from service in 1994 after getting the name B-134. And as of 2008, her reactor is in temporary storage. So sometime between 1994 and 2008, she was decommissioned. K-34/134. So yeah, the Echo II, let me kind of sum this up. First of all, the Echo II was not a good submarine. It was designed to launch missiles. It only did that with a 70% success rate, which by Russian standards was acceptable. But it had to make the submarine vulnerable for up to 30 minutes to conduct a full attack, at least 12 minutes. And in modern naval warfare, you're not going to survive more than a few minutes after you're detected. You're going to survive long enough for a missile or a weapon to get to your position. And that's not going to take 12 minutes. That's going to take a few minutes. If it's a long ways away, it could be a lot sooner than that. So she was not a good missile attack submarine. Even if she got her attack off, she was not going to survive it. And there was a good chance that those missiles would malfunction. They would certainly malfunction if they didn't have the guidance radar to direct them to their target. Because until they went autonomous at their enable point, they were useless. They were ballistic. They were just following a radar beam. If that radar beam goes away, they have no guidance. Okay, so as a missile submarine, not very good. As an attack submarine, she wasn't good either because she could only do 22 knots and she was very noisy. So she wasn't good for either job, as a missile boat or an attack boat. Because she had to remain surface during these attacks, even the new P500 supersonic missile, which had obviously a much shorter flight time, wouldn't save her. It would probably make the attack a little more successful, but it wouldn't save the ship. The fire control system only allowed for 4 missiles per salvo. That's just a limitation of the technology of the day, and that 12 minutes per attack. Presumably the 12-minute attack is shorter with the P500 missile. Again, they never used the P1000 for deployment, but they did have capability of going underway with them, which they did for testing. But never on deployment. Okay, the Echo II was too noisy to be effective. I kind of already went over that. Oh, and the reactor safety record. Man, the Echo II killed a lot of Russian sailors. Whether it was the Freon system or the reactor or a missile malfunction, this ship was just dangerous. It was ineffective and dangerous to the crew. And the men who served on her, I'm sure, knew that they were risking their lives every time they got on board one of these things. It's amazing they didn't kill more Russian sailors, and thankfully they didn't. So not a very good submarine, but again, it was a Type 1 first flight coming out of the Cold War, and they learned a lot of lessons from the Echo II and made a better one that we'll talk about in another lecture called the Juliet, a diesel boat. All right, so I would like to say thank you for everybody for listening to this very long lecture. I hope you enjoyed the stories and understand how dangerous the Echo II SSGN was. Thank you very much to our division officers, these very generous gentlemen Our division officer members of the Patreon page, Sean O'Neill, Scott Borg, and Brendan Ferry. Thank you very much for being as generous as you guys are. I really do appreciate it. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.